Hi, it's Tony Chapman. I'm the host of the podcast Chatter That Matters. 2008, something very special happened to me. I was inducted into the Canada's Marketing Hall of Legends. It's one of the proudest moments of my career because my family was there, one of the proudest moments of my life. You see, in this hall are people that have put a dent in the marketplace. We have visionaries who came up with ideas. We have business builders that not only established their brand in Canada, but around the world. We have stewards of brands who found a way to engage the head and heart and hands of the consumer and the media. We have leaders and creators that built campaigns that dance all over media. This is more than the Hall of Legends. If you think about it, it's the Hall of Learning. Imagine the intellectual resource that exists within it. The lessons in life, the journey, the overcoming circumstances, the tightropes, the way they reinvented and reimagined the world. The American Marketing Association's Toronto chapter came up with this idea of curating this learning. And what they've done is they've created the Legends Journey, Lessons in Leadership. We're gonna take some of the people that are in this hall, spend some time interviewing them, draw out what they bring not only to your livelihood, but ideally to your life. So thank you for being part of Lessons in Leadership and the Legends Journey.
Hi, it's Tony Chapman, and welcome to the special edition of Chatter That Matters, in collaboration with the Toronto chapter of the American Marketing Association. And our guest today, Malcolm Gladwell. And our timing couldn't be better, because Malcolm Gladwell has been inducted into Canada's Marketing Hall of Legends, tested to a career where he has defined the narrative, not only in business corridors, but in society overall. I mean, when you think back to his body of work, this groundbreaking book, The Tipping Point, to the introspective Talking to Strangers, they invite us to see beyond the mundane. He often explores how small changes can ignite significant shifts and how misunderstood moments can shape our lives. Malcolm's genius lies in uncovering hidden patterns of human behavior and his ability to weave these insights into stories that matter, stories that challenge, inspire, and provoke. As we chat today, we'll discover the inspiration behind his most pivotal writing moments and the personal insights that guide his exploration of complex social truths. Malcolm Gladwell, welcome to Chatter That Matters.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
First of all, I want to just congratulate you for being inducted into Canada's Marketing Hall of Legends. There's 100 luminaries in there, and I mean, they use the word marketing, but it really is a hall of extraordinary builders and visionaries and thought leaders. So we're just delighted that you're going to be taking your place and at our 20th anniversary.
I am delighted as well. I'm very honored.
And I think it's just it's testament to a career where I really believe your narrative has crossed like so many genres, from business corridors to society to academia, and I think it's just it's really just testament to the fact that you can cross so many different areas, and every one of them has a great appetite for what you do. So I want to talk to you a little bit about I told you earlier that my podcast is about journeys, and I'm fascinated by your work because it's this incredible fusion of left brain and right brain. And one of my first questions is that because this DNA of your parents is roaring through you? And I want to start maybe first with your mother, Jamaican, and she really had this sense of, I felt, culture, that she really wanted to level the playing field, that she really wanted to let people know that we're all part of the human race.
Yeah, I think that's a fair estimate, a fair description of my mother's perspective. She is by profession a marriage and family therapist, and I think is, if you're looking for some kind of contribution of my mother's, the way I'm thinking, the way I think that's probably where you should start. I mean, she's someone who is very profoundly curious about the human condition, about the ways in which people relate to each other, about the kinds of struggles people have and how to fix them and how to help them. I mean, these are, it's almost the perfect preparation for a journalist to have someone who has that range of interests be your own mother.
And, she wrote her memoir, Brown Faced Big Master, I believe it was titled, and you in an article I read about it, you said that was also instrumental in the sense that she was, in some ways, hoping that you would continue to carry on that I don't want to even use the word battle, but carry that torch forward to say that that empathy and concern from one another is something that she felt was a very important attribute to give to her son.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the first. Her book was probably the first adult book I read. So by definition, it's going to have an enormous impact on me. And it's a book that's very, very. It's funny. You can trace I think a bright line from that book to the books that I write, because it's very much a book about an individual in the context of their world and environment. Where she's describing the kind of the collision between who she was and what she believed, and the places she found herself, first Jamaica and then England, in the 50s and early 60s. And those are themes that I continue to explore on my own. That idea that there is something very interesting happens when who we are meets where we are.
And that vein that you mine, and I often use the word insight. You remind me sometimes of Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David, in the sense that they call it a show about nothing, but when you watch the show, you realize it was something quite extraordinary happened. That they found something about how somebody thought, felt, or did that you draw parallels to, and then on the other side of it, though, it's not just that narrative. It's kind of your dad, the mathematician, coming through. Because you back so much of those insights with research and diving deeper into what you could have just written a book on intuition, but you seem to really combine that left brain and right brain.
Yeah, I mean, you can't have a father who is a mathematician and not also have a kind of realize that your arguments have to have some rigor. Mathematics is all about. It's about proof. It's about showing how you reached your conclusion. It's about logic. It's all of those things. So it's easy, I think, to get lost in psychology, in stories and descriptions when you're writing about people and their motivations, and not realize that you have to anchor what you're saying in something solid. And I've always tried to kind of find the science that supports the arguments that I'm making. So there's something solid in what I'm writing about, not such as Malcolm sounding off.
Have you ever abandoned something because you fell in love with this insight? You really felt that this was something to really explore, that something that deserved a book. And yet, as you started doing research, it challenged some of that and made you question whether this was, in fact, a branch on a tree that could turn into something.
Not really, because I tend to start with the science. So I find my ideas come from reading the scientific literature and finding things that already have support. So it's not that I have a notion and then I go looking. It's that I go looking and then have a notion. I rarely ever start unless I know that there is some evidence for what I'm pursuing. The stories always come afterwards.
And as you're starting to create this book or this body of work, and I look at that, you're right. I mean, when I think of Tom Peters' In Search of Excellence and Jim Collins from Good to Great. I mean, when you started off with the tipping point, did you go out ever imagining that you would have something that would become part of people's vernacular, that almost overnight people would start framing their situations, their circumstances, the momentum that might be behind a brand or a career as the tipping point?
No, I had no. I mean, no one was more taken by surprise than I was. Particularly with my first book, it just seemed to come out of nowhere. I was just trying to describe something that interests me personally, I was living in New York City, and one day New York City was one of the most dangerous big cities in North America, and the next day it wasn't. And I just found that so bizarre and so inexplicable that I wanted to write about it. But it never occurred to me that there would be it would have the kind of cultural reverberation that it did.
So I want to back it up now, because what led to the tipping point, I had no idea how much work you did as a journalist prior to it, but you go to the University of Toronto and you take a history degree, and then you move very quickly south to the border, and within not that very short order, I mean, you're not covering, a cat in a tree. The work and the assignments that are giving you continue to grow as the papers and that you start working for. So if you could just frame that sense of career trajectory and what was behind it, that you could have so much momentum at such a young age.
Yeah. I got a job out of university with a little tiny magazine in Bloomington, Indiana. I lasted there about 7 months, and then I got fired. And then I went to Washington, D.C. and worked for a think tank for about a year or so. And then I went to work for another obscure little magazine. And all the time I was freelancing, though, for more serious magazines, for things. And I caught the attention of an editor at the Washington Post. And it was a time when the Washington Post was the heyday of newspapers, when they were enormously profitable places, and they were hiring. I got very lucky. My story doesn't happen today because newspapers aren't hiring in the way they were hiring back then. But when I went to work at the Washington Post in 1987, they were one of the most profitable big companies in the country. So they had resources and they're willing to take chances on young, unproven reporters, and they were interested in telling different kinds of stories because they could. And I got there right at the right time. And you're right, I avoided normally when reporters come in, they get assigned to the Metro section, and they do. They write about cats and trees and school board meetings. But I became a business reporter, which was a non-glamorous role at the Washington Post. But it was an incredible opportunity for a young reporter because I got to write about things on the national stage. And that just greatly accelerated my growth as a journalist.
Did you ever feel at the time an imposter, especially when you're going to the Washington Post? As you said, and you could clearly argue one of the top newspapers in the world, and then you're walking in to cover business stories, and you're not necessarily going in with a Wharton MBA, or you're going in with a Rolodex of contacts. You're kind of just having to find your own way. And was there ever a time where you went, what am I doing here? Or did you always have that sort of inner confidence that there was a story, I could find it and I could write about it?
Well, I mean, I'm not someone who's generally plagued by self-doubt. And also I felt like I was playing with house money. I mean, I was in the US. I had never imagined that I would be. I never imagined I'd have a job in journalism. I never imagined I'd be hired by the Washington Post. It seemed like such a kind of inexplicable series of events that brought me to where I was, that if it all fell apart, I wouldn't feel like I had failed. I would have just thought, things have just gone back to normal. So I was, even several years into my time at the Washington Post, I was still very seriously considering going to business school, which had been my goal for quite some time. So I didn't. It took me a while to kind of commit to what I was doing. It was more a lark than anything else. I never kind of took it seriously enough to get to the stage where I might have imposter syndrome.
One of the reasons we do these videos with the people in the legends is to share learnings with the young generation coming up. And do you think that is a lesson in life for them to take some of the pressure off of those first 5 years or 10 years of a career and just go into there, maybe not having the same confidence you did to say it was a lark, but just to go in there to learn and experience and enjoy versus wondering what the next move on the chessboard will be?
Yeah, I've often thought the most important thing I did and have done my entire career is I've always chosen the path that was the most enjoyable. I think you have to have fun. And when you're having fun, I think you do your best work and you're most appealing to others and you learn the easiest. And so I just avoided things that I thought I wouldn't enjoy. Now, by which I didn't mean that I was avoiding all the kind of necessary apprenticeship. But I thought the apprenticeship was fun. I mean, I think I enjoyed the fact that I didn't know anything about newspaper writing and I got to learn. I just thought that was kind of thrilling, that I got to master some new... And there are all these brilliant people around me who were more than happy to teach me. And I learned something else, which is that people do want to teach young people. I mean, it's not... I don't know. Sometimes I think, or at least I had imagined that, the working world would be hostile to you if you were starting out, that somehow people would feel like it was a waste of time or a chore to teach young people what they were doing. I always found the exact opposite, that senior people love nothing more than passing on their knowledge to others. And once I realized that the system is set up to make you succeed if you just are enthusiastic and willing to work hard.
The connective tissue of the American Marketing Association is a sense of mentorship. That's what the Toronto's chapter is known for. Does it take a certain type of individual to be open to be mentored, so that the people that have that knowledge are saying, I'm willing to invest in you? Or do you think it's just something that we should all as a society realize it's out there if we just raise our hand and say we're looking for it?
I think it's out there. I think what's fairly universal is a desire of older people to teach, to pass on what they know. I almost feel like that's an evolutionary... Society could not have survived as long as it has and grown as it has over the last hundreds of thousands of years if we weren't hardwired to want to pass on our expertise to young people, right? That's not cultural or specific to certain individuals. That's baked into us. The challenge is on the receiving end. Are you willing to learn from people like that? Is your mind open? Are you willing to work hard? Are you willing to make mistakes and not get discouraged? I think all of the onus is on the receiving party, not the sending party.
And do you think in our society, in the Western society, we are that open of an exchange from the elderly? I'm not talking about our indigenous population, but just in general, the Western, maybe it's framed as Hollywood's Western society, compared to some of the, Asian and South Asian societies where it seems like the elderly are revered and the lessons in life are part of the journey of learning?
I mean, as we speak, the two candidates for president in the United States are respectively, late 70s and early 80s or whatever it is. So, I don't know, it seems like the elderly are occupying some fairly significant positions in the West. I know what you're saying. I know that there are cultures that consciously elevate elders to a position of respect. But I think that we do the same. We just are not as kind of formal about it. I still, I'm 60 and I still find myself deferring to people older than myself who have had more experience. I mean, maybe the thing that's crucial is to disconnect age and experience. I think that the issue is not how old the person is. The issue is, do they know more than you? Have they seen more? And where that is the case, I think that most of us are willing to learn.
And where did the move? I mean, you're at the Washington Post, and your career is moving, and yet you make a move. You make another big move in your journalistic career to the New Yorker.
Yeah, I had moved to New York to be the New York correspondent for the Washington Post, and I wanted to stay in New York, and that was going to be difficult if I stayed with the Washington Post. But I also realized that I was better suited for magazine writing and book writing than I was for daily journalism. I was never a great daily reporter. It takes a certain degree of energy and
Compromise, I have to believe, too. I mean,
and ultimately I realized, I want to write things that are longer and take my time. What I do, more kind of thoughtful pieces, and so I had learned what I felt I needed to learn from newspapers, and I was ready. This is when I was in my kind of mid-30s. I was ready to move on.
And you were becoming quite famous, from what I understand. The research I've done, that your articles you were writing in that magazine were well received. But that's another big jump, moving to that first book, as you said, the tipping point. And was it really because you saw how quickly New York had tipped for the better?
Yeah, that was the impetus. I just was so mystified by it. I got to New York in '93, and it was a frightening place. And then by '96, it wasn't frightening anymore. I just found it so weird. It really did feel like an epidemic had passed. And I decided to take that metaphor seriously. What if it really actually was an epidemic? Well, how do epidemics behave? That was the kind of thought process I was following. And that got me going. And then I decided, there was a million different directions sort of presented themselves from there.
What I love about your writing is the way you bring characters to life, almost like it's fiction. Like you when you Paul Revere and you're riding with them, and it. Where did that come from? Because that just, you started honing it as you started writing longer form with the magazines, or was that something that you were always, from your history lessons in the past and the University of Toronto stuff, that you just said that character development is so important, so people don't buy yet another business book and read a chapter and way down their end table, that they're going to get caught up in the story and ride with me?
Yeah. I think it comes from the New Yorker. That was something I learned. I began to study other writers that I loved and try and learn from them. Janet Malcolm, Michael Lewis, Adam Gopnik, all of whom that was their gift, was capturing someone's character. And I very consciously read their articles or their books, their journalism, and tried to figure out what they were doing and how I could kind of learn to do the same thing. It was not something that was in my repertoire before I started taking magazine writing seriously.
Was there more of your dad or more of your mom coming through at that time of your life, or you've always felt this sort of balanced? Because again, when I read about your parents, I said, now I understand how you put these pieces together.
I think it was always a balance. I mean, at various times, one legacy may be in slight ascendancy over another, but I think in general, it's always been those two forces propelling me forward.
And when they read your books, do they kind of read the parts where they felt that's them roaring through you?
I have no idea. You'll have to ask them. Yeah.
It's interesting. And so the tipping point it just takes off. It's a multi-million bestseller. I have to believe your life changes dramatically at that point.
No, not really. I mean, I continued to write for the New Yorker for another 10 years or more, 15 years. It didn't really. It's funny. I thought maybe it would, but it doesn't. It didn't change the kind of fundamental task of being a working journalist. It gave me confidence that what I was doing had a constituency, so that changed. It made it, doors opened more easily if I wanted to talk to someone. If if someone knows who you are, they're more willing to talk to you. So that was easier, but it didn't alter much more than that. I mean, it's funny. It's kind of like, it's a different kind of, literary success is a different kind of success than other professional success. There's not a clear hierarchy. You join the group of people who have written books, but it's not like the legal profession, where you could point to someone who is the great rainmaker or the great trial lawyer of their generation or the great judge. There's not the same thing going on, I think, in the literary world.
And how hard was it? Because I have to believe that you were suddenly in demand to come and speak at my conference. We want Malcolm Gladwell. We want to know the thinking behind the tipping point. Was that a hard move for you to make, or did that come quite naturally as well?
Well, there was a real learning curve. I mean, I had to I did speaking for a couple of years, and then I decided that I would take it seriously. So I began to very consciously prepare in a different way, to learn a lot more about the people I was. I think in the first wave of speaking, people just go and they give a spiel about their book. It's the same spiel every time up. And I began to realize that was not a way to have a sustained speaking career. And so I committed way more time and attention to my speaking because I realized how central it was to getting my name out there, and also how much I enjoyed it. It's way more enjoyable when you do take more time and you understand what your audience wants, and you try and tailor something so it could be useful. So it's people. It shouldn't just a talk. It should not be about you advertising your wares. It should be about you understanding what your audience needs. Why did they bring you here? And then trying to kind of give them something useful.
And what was the most wonderful thing someone has said to you after a speech? Because I do a lot of speaking. I remember a couple comments and I went, that was special.
Nothing, just in general. If people they're enjoying themselves, like if they're laughing, if they're clapping at the end, if they come up to me, and I just, you when you're talking, you look out in the room and you could tell whether they want to be there or not. And if they're not on their phones, or they're not like nodding off, and you have their attention, then you succeeded. That's really what I'm looking for.
This attention is a key word, because I'm finding now that the audience is really often very disengaged from life because they've got the world within arm's reach of desire. Have you changed your speaking style? Have you adjusted and adapted based on that next generation coming in, wanting content at the speed of life?
No, I'm not sure I agree with you, actually. I think what's going on is I think that attention spans have grown at one extreme and shrunk at the other extreme. That what we're doing now is toggling back and forth between, the same generation that watches 10-second TikTok videos will also watch a 10-part miniseries on Netflix.
And spend 36 hours hammering down a video game, for sure.
Yeah. So it's like, I think what's gone away is the middle. I think people will commit to something that's compelling, or they want to be entertained by something that's immediate. And they will happily go back and forth between those two states.
So I watch a lot of biographies of artists, and I'm always fascinated by the next move. And, I have to follow up that hit album with another album. How hard was it for you to get going on a second book, knowing that in some ways you're going to be judged by the success of your first?
I do. It's been so long ago now. I'm difficulty remembering, but I don't remember feeling any great anxiety about it. I just remember that I took my time in figuring out what it was going to be about. I was just waiting for something to seize my imagination as much as my first book had. And luckily I found something relatively quickly that, snap judgments and first impressions, that kind of, because I had just been talking to psychologists about them, and I just found it really interesting. And once my rule was simply, if I'm interested in it, then chances are someone else will be too. And I found myself just really captured by that topic. And so I had the confidence to go forward.
How do you think Blink now factors into the world of AI, where we have such intuitive software and this big data? does it have even more meaningful role for people to say that their gut and their judgment is paramount?
It's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't really have a good answer to that. That book was so conceived in this pre-AI world that I haven't gone back and thought about it. I mean, I would imagine that, since good judgment is the marriage of rational, analytic thinking and the expertise, the unconscious expertise born of experience, that I imagine AI may make good decision-making easier. I mean, it helps us with the first of those two, doesn't it? So that's my only sense, that maybe I can see how overall it would make us better decision-makers.
And Outliers, it was, to me, I would argue 10,000 hours of practice, the math of when you were born. I mean, that became conversation in the schoolyards. I mean, that to me, it traveled like liquid everywhere. Did you ever imagine it was going to have that much impact? Or did you first write it as a business book? Or did you realize that hockey mums and dads would be starting to look at the future, whether their kid's going to get to the NHL based on what they saw out of that book?
Yeah, I didn't. It's funny. I did not see that coming. I wrote that section. I thought it was interesting. I didn't think it would be the most talked about thing in the book, and I've been amused to see how far people have taken the 10,000 hour rule. They've taken it far further than I expected it would ever go. So I'm not sure I even agree with many of the ways people have made sense of that argument. But parents still come up to me and say, "I read your book and I held my kids back a year." So I mean, it goes on and on and on and on.
You might have some kids coming at you. They're in their 30s pretty soon, wondering why they got held back because of the book.
Yeah.
There's at times that you've had critics that have come out, and sometimes when I've read this criticism, it's almost, I would say, jealous, because you've caught the narrative, and people are now understanding complex subjects in a very tight meme, like 10,000 hours. How do you deal with, does criticism bother you, or do you just go, that fuels me to defend or to push back on?
I don't get. I mean, I'm not very thin-skinned, so I think maybe when you're younger, it hurts a little more, and then by the time you're my age, I mean, I've been doing this for so long, it doesn't. And you become aware, what you realize is that all work has its share of supporters and criticisms and critics, and there's no way around it. You hope that the proportion is skewed in your favor. That's all you can hope for. But when you mentioned Seinfeld before, Seinfeld, when it first came out, was panned. Critics hated it. I mean, so I don't know. Can't look at that and take criticism all that seriously.
So I got two themes that you've talked about. The sense of maybe there's a greater divide, the middle's disappeared. Do you think does that exist even in terms of people that are supporters or against, that we've lost the middle ground? Because that's one of the things I'm looking at society going, why do we seem to be so pushed far out, where North against the South, red against blue, Canada, French against English? It seems to be a greater divide. Maybe it's just the news that we're taking, but do you think that middle is still there, that you can put something out and have somebody that's against and for, but the mass is really standing firm saying, this is something I love?
Yeah, it's true that this kind of disappearing middle, you can see it in all kinds of different domains. It's troublesome in some domains. In other domains, though, I don't know whether I don't know. It's funny. I think it's the kind of thing that it's probably a mistake to have one very generalized response to what is clearly a very complicated. And at the same time, I would also say that I don't think that one conclusion you could draw from this is that the generalist is dead. And all we have are people who know nothing and people who know a lot, right? But then there's lots of other evidence that says the generalist is now much more important and much more kind of accurate than ever. So I don't know. This is something I'm wrestling with, and I'm maybe as confused as everybody else about it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'd love one day for you to take that on and biases and, confirmation biases. Do we get pushed in such a little castle with like-minded people liking like-minded content, validating each other, that we start loving that and hating the other? Or is it just a wave going through? The other thing I wanted to just ask you about, when you said earlier, the conditions were right for me at the Washington Post because they were hiring at the time. Do you think a New York City can happen again, where in a very short period of time, this magic wand, this epidemic that you say can wash over a city and take it from a sort of chaos and crime and confusion to being something that people are very proud of?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it can and will happen all the time. I mean, I think that's the nature of, we saw a repeat of it over COVID. Homicides in major North American cities spiked over COVID. They're now plummeting. I mean, they're down. This year alone, I think in New York City, homicides are down 25%. So it's like, that's what the line looks like, epidemic line. The mistake was in thinking that these kinds of trends move gradually by nature. I think that the natural course is for them to veer up and down quite dramatically. And that when they do flatline for a while, that's the aberration.
It's interesting. What the Dog Saw in Other Adventures, your New York stories, it was curious, the motivation. Was that a publisher saying, Malcolm, we need another book? Or was that your chance to say, I have a new audience out there and there's some stories that deserve more attention?
I mean, I can't remember. I think it's probably a mixture of both. The New Yorker has a quirk where the writers own their stories. So you can do anthologies, and I just thought it'd be a fun way to. I thought that my sense was that many of the people who read my books did not read my New Yorker articles, so I thought this would be a fun way to expose them to that.
And David and Goliath, which is, was that a title that was very similar to your mom's memoir, in the sense of that the underdog that you called and the misfits, that that we're really framing these people in a very different lens than they should be thought of?
I don't know. It's funny. I mean, the real impetus for David and Goliath is that it was a companion to Outliers. Outliers was concerned with how advantages lead to success. And David and Goliath was saying, well, sometimes the advantages look like disadvantages. We're usefully compensating for something that might otherwise be seen as a hindrance or a drawback or a constraint. So it was really, that's what I was thinking about. Like, what's interesting to me about the story of David and Goliath is David's adaptation to his own weakness. And that, I think the adaptation to weakness is as common or more common, a kind of real world phenomenon, than capitalizing on strength. And the more I see, I just read the biography of Elon Musk, and his whole success story is about that. Why is SpaceX the way it is? Because he didn't have any money, and he didn't have the contacts at NASA, and he was forced to do something entirely new. And that's why he succeeded so dramatically. Had he come in with $1 billion, SpaceX never happens. It's super interesting, the very thing we think we do to enable an entrepreneur, give them lots of resources, in that case would have destroyed exactly what made him great.
Do you think David and Goliath, I mean, to me, it was so far ahead of its time when I look today at the disruptors that are, attacking and taking down what we all thought were too big to fail because they didn't have the resources. They had to use their imagination. They had to mine for... do you not think that what you were writing back then is really what we're seeing with capitalism today? At least a capitalism, to me, that's got a higher sense of purpose and momentum?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think whenever you're in the middle of a kind of technological transition, as we are now, I think the normal rules don't apply, and things that, the value of an entrenched position is diminished. And I think we're seeing examples of that. Maybe being Ford, with all of your entrenched position in the automobile industry, is a hindrance in adapting to an electric future. I don't know. I mean, in some ways, if you're locked into the old way, it's harder to move to the new way. Two biggest electric car companies in the world are startups, BYD and Tesla. So there's a lot of that going on. And the idea that, the biggest media companies in the world didn't exist a generation before. That's crazy. We had media companies that were hugely important for over 100 years. And suddenly, Washington Post being one of them. Washington Post is today a money-losing also-ran. It was for close to 100 years, was a huge, huge player in the world of journalism.
And also a player in the world of how society thought, felt, and behaved. I mean, I know I'm pressing on time because how busy you are, but do you ever think of yourself as a modern Sun Tzu, the Art of War? Like, as you start looking at how he approached competition, the marketplace, retreating and attacking, because I look at some of the books you write, and you kind of, somehow or other, you bring some of those quotes to life in the most extraordinary fashions. Or is that just me with some wild imagination?
I don't know if I see it in that. That's very good company to be in, but I'm not sure I'm deserving.
But the enemy himself provides the opportunity to defeat the enemy. To me, in some ways, is what David and Goliath was about.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, it's a theme that has shown up in many, particularly military. People who think about the military think about this a lot, because anyone well versed in the military knows that the army with the most resources does not always win.
Talking to strangers, I loved how, I think it was an interview you did with Oprah, where she started personalizing her talks with strangers. I mean, what was the motivation behind that book? What people reading it at the end of it, what would be your desired outcome in terms of how they would maybe change something about themselves?
I was just struck by how many of the cases I was reading about were examples of communication breakdown between strangers. It was I started that book with one of the signature cases from that wave of high-profile police cases in the U.S. But I mean, but the more I sort of thought about it, the more I realized that an extraordinary number of contemporary controversies were simply versions of the same problem, that two people had attempted to communicate and failed. And I thought that as a premise for a book, that was an enormously powerful one.
Again, it takes me back to trying to invite people back to the middle ground where people might have opposing views, but if you take your time to communicate it, you often find you have more in common than you thought.
Yeah. I mean, it was, somehow I feel like we had lost track of the tools, communication tools that bring us together. They've somehow been mislaid, and I wanted to find them again and bring them back to people's attention.
Is there ever been a character in one of your books that you say is really me? Or has there been many characters in your book that you me?
That's just interesting. Not really. I mean, I don't...
are you a maven? Are you
not really. No, I'm not. I don't. Usually, I'm attracted to writing about people because they are very different from me. So I'm not certain. That doesn't happen because I think I would never interview someone who I thought there would be no point. There would be nothing to learn. I'm most interested in people if they're not like me because that maximizes the amount that I can learn from them.
One of the phenomenons, and this is going to be a question to you as well, is that we're now seeing a lot of people that have built a network, that have built currency with a lot of people, no longer wanting to sing for the supper. They want to own their diner. The Ryan Reynolds of the world, the Rihannas. Was that one of the motivations of you starting a podcast company versus just doing the podcast, that you said, I have an ability to create great content, and in doing so, that be rewarded for it?
Well, no. Because as I quickly learned, I don't think that was my motivation. I think my motivation was I'd like to have the freedom to do cool things. And the easiest way to do that, to remove the friction, is just to have my own company. I didn't think that it was the easiest way I wasn't doing it for economic reasons. And, one of the things I've learned is that very, very, very few people in the podcast world get rich. It's not what it's about. You're giving up, in some senses, you're giving up that opportunity in exchange for freedom. That's what it's about. It's about freedom. But you can put together your own little crew and you can publish it for free on a platform, and you don't have anybody saying you can't do it. And to me, that's what the value is. And, it may be the case that incidentally, some people do well economically, but it's the far more important outcome is the liberty it gives you.
So as we wrap up this interview, we talked about mentorship earlier on and how important it is for the Toronto chapter. And what advice would you give to young people that would say to you, I just feel like the headwinds are pushing me in my back feet. Is the climate going to melt? Am AI going to take away my job? Am I getting a university degree that I don't need? What advice would you give to them for them so that they could, instead of thinking about impossibility, think about possibility?
Yeah, I guess I would say find something that you're interested in and be good at it. I mean, I think, like, for example, as I always tell people who want to go into journalism, who want to write books or what have you, the most important thing is not working, if you want to prepare for that, it's not working for a journalistic enterprise. It's finding something that you want to write about, right? Knowing, if you want to be a foreign correspondent, the first thing you do is you learn another language, right? So the first thing you do is not look for a job as a foreign correspondent. If you know German and you have read deeply in German history and talked to German people and like hanging out in Germany, that's the way to become a foreign correspondent in Germany, right? You have to kind of, so it's like, that notion of kind of building a knowledge base that gives you authenticity and credibility in the marketplace. I had a guy drive me to the airport the other day and was telling me about his son, who said, "What does your son do?" He says, "Oh, he's a producer at ESPN." It's like, wow, how do you get that job? And he said, well, from the time he was 5 years old, when other kids were watching Sesame Street, he was watching SportsCenter on ESPN. And when he was in college and high school, he started a radio show, sports radio, and he would do play-by-play announcing of their school sports teams. And, that makes sense, right? He made himself the kind of person that ESPN couldn't but hire. right? How'd you turn that kid down? Like, he's like, he's exactly what you want. Like, but he did that. And then he consciously sought to build his credibility as someone who's, out of enthusiasm and love for, and that's the kind of, find the thing that you can build your own expertise around and for which you have enthusiasm and love. And you will be irresistible, I think, to others.
And I understand we have a book coming out in the fall. Is there anything we can tease in this show to let people...
Yeah, it's a sequel to The Tipping Point. So it's a return to my first book.
And what are we going to see out of that sort of takes us into 2024 and beyond?
Well, I'm really interested in how much on establishing who's responsible for epidemics. Do they just happen, or are they the result of deliberate decisions that people make? And if they are, if the latter is true, then what are those decisions and who are those people? That's really what the book's about.
So, Malcolm, I always end my podcast with 3 takeaways that I will talk about and remember. And the first is just the word empathy came through almost everything that you. And so I think there's a lot of your mom in you, but I just love the way you always, I interview people that are smarter. I talk to people that are smarter. I mean, you just really have this great curiosity and love. I think the second one for every person living out there, whether you're 20 years old or you're 70, is just find that passion, pursue it, fall in love. And I love what you say. It'll make you irresistible. And the third thing is just how you continue to be curious. And, you're not doing a sequel to Tipping Point because it was the thing to do. It's because you're now curious about how epidemics happen. And I think curiosity is one of the greatest attributes. And if you're living in a world with AI nowadays and you're curious, you've got yourself an army of Davids to work for you. So for all of that and more, we really appreciate you taking the time. And again, congratulations for joining us in Canada's Marketing Hall of Legends.
Thank you so much, Tony. This is really fun.
It's Tony Chapman. Thanks for listening, and let's chat soon.